Texas is arguably the only state in America where residents feel more patriotic about their state than their country. The Lone Star State certainly has reason to be prideful. It's synonymous with the American West, the second biggest state in terms of land and people, and has the second biggest state economy. No state captures the spirit of America quite like Texas. That's why whenever the idea of Texas seceding pops up, it always turns heads. A poll in 2016 found that 40% of Texans would have supported seceding from the United States if Hillary Clinton had won the election that year. And since then, state senators have proposed multiple ballot initiatives surrounding the question of seceding. A so-called Texit is difficult to imagine, but would it actually be possible for Texas to secede today? And could they actually survive as its own country if they did? Well, before talking about why some Texans want to secede from America, we need to talk about the time they actually did secede from their country. At least successfully. After Mexico gained its independence from Spain in the Mexican War of Independence in 1821, it had a problem. The Comanche Indians, numbering 20 to 40,000 people at their peak, controlled large swaths of land in the southern plains, including Texas, and frequently raided Mexican land and killed those who lived there. To help fend off these attacks and attract settlers, Mexico allowed foreigners to settle land in the area and set up the empresario system, where a settler was promised land if they managed to convince a certain number of people to move there as well. While the plan worked, it created a new problem. American settlers, mainly arriving illegally, outnumbered Mexicans in Texas by more than 7-1 by the eve of the Texas Revolution in 1835. These American settlers didn't assimilate as Mexico hoped they would, including by learning the language, converting to Catholicism, or following Mexican laws, especially their ban on slavery. These differences, alongside the Mexican president's increasingly authoritarian leadership, led to revolution, and Texas gained independence shortly after. After becoming a country, Texas's congressional leaders quickly voted to seek to be annexed by the United States. It might be odd that Texas would want to lose its sovereignty so soon after gaining it, but it was in their best interest. Mexico didn't recognize Texas as an independent country, but rather as a Mexican state that had a higher level of autonomy and a path to independence. A path that Texans knew could be closed off eventually. They hoped that being under America's wing would protect it against Mexican incursion and the still continuing Comanche raids. And of course, most Texans were already American and wanted to live in the country that they'd left so recently. So after a decade of debate in Congress about the risk of war with Mexico and the annexation's impact on the issue of slavery, Texas officially became a state. This founding history is a large part of where Texans got their independence streak. Texas began with revolution and was born with the same founding beliefs that America had in 1776. It's certainly a story more exciting than most other states have, and Texas makes sure its people don't forget it. They make sure their students remember the Alamo and Goliad while making them pledge allegiance to the American and Texan flags every day. They named their biggest cities, counties, and colleges after their founding fathers. Texas has an identity that, although partially co-opted into wider American culture, is entirely its own, and this fact is vital to the chances of a state choosing to secede. A study conducted by Southern Methodist University in Dallas found that across the world, support for secession would drop on average by almost 7% if regional identity matched national identity. The study also found that support for secessions triples to 20% on average if there are cultural differences within a region. So, Texas's strong sense of identity gives it a higher natural inclination for supporting secession, and the political diversions happening across America these days only add fuel to the fire. Of course, Texas isn't the only state dealing with polarization or the only one with a secession movement. It's not even the one with the strongest case for secession. That honor would go to the America's most recent state, Hawaii. Some Native Hawaiians claim that because Hawaii was annexed by a resolution and not with a treaty as something like this would require, the annexation was illegal. Imagine if Joe Biden signed a bill admitting Greenland as the 51st state without asking them. This, plus the fact that Congress admitted that the Kingdom of Hawaii never formally surrendered their sovereignty, is why activists claim they should have wider autonomy on the islands than other states do. While some Native Hawaiians want the islands to become fully independent from the United States, many more want to have land returned to them, and to gain more autonomy on that land. If any state has a legal argument for secession, Hawaii does, even if most aren't seeking it. Back on the mainland, California has flirted with secession too. The movement started in 2015 with Yes, California, a conservative movement that wanted to redefine California's relationship with the rest of the country and turn it into a, quote, nation within a nation. They argue that California has a unique history and a robust enough economy to go it alone. and they're not wrong on the economic front. California has a state GDP of $3.7 trillion, making it technically the 5th largest economy on Earth, and would be the 38th largest country in terms of population on its own. Some Californians felt their beliefs weren't being represented well anymore and wanted out. Even with this extra motivation to secede, most Californians just won't get behind it. Support for secession was only at 32% after the 2016 election, up just 12% from 3 years before. No initiatives that would support secession or a negotiated relationship with the US have been successfully put on the ballot, and support for secession has fallen to just 14%. But secession movements don't need much support to achieve their goals, however, especially if those goals don't actually include secession. In 1982, the US Federal Border Patrol set up a roadblock on the only land-based entry into Key West, Florida, which threatened the island's tourism business. After failing to get the courts to support removing the roadblock, Key West's mayor had to find another way to fight the roadblock. He decided that Key West's best option was a publicity stunt. He declared himself Prime Minister of the newly independent state of what he named the Conch Republic, and chose to wage a mock war against the United States, during which he hit a man dressed as a Navy officer over the head with a loaf of bread. The mayor surrendered to authorities and asked for $1 billion in war relief. Needless to say, he didn't get the money, but the publicity he attracted made the Border Patrol remove the roadblock. I'd say this is the only successful attempted secession from the United States, depending on how you look at it. There are plenty more secession movements in other states as well. The Alaskan Independence Party is a libertarian third party that was founded to push for a peaceful secession from the US, arguing that Washington doesn't care about the needs or opinions of Alaskans. There are a lot of similarities between secession movements across the country. With the exception of Hawaii and California, most supporters of secessions are conservative and motivated by the idea that the federal government has too much power from their state at the expense of the people. Several of these movements, especially the more conservative ones, believe that the collapse of the United States is inevitable and that their state will eventually become independent anyways. All of these modern secession movements have been non-violent as well, with the notable exception at one point of Texas. That point came with their third push for secession in the 90s, from the Republic of Texas, a group in West Texas that believed that the state's original annexation was illegitimate. They gave the governor a notice of eviction and sued the federal government for $93 trillion in reparations. The organization fell apart when its founder and a few of his followers broke into a house they felt was strategically located for their cause and held its residents hostage. Both hostages and the people who took them hostage and their leader surrendered. The next year, the group was busted for planning to assassinate Bill Clinton and other government officials. The Republic of Texas disbanded shortly after these acts of terror and was succeeded by the Texas nationalist movement several years later. But instead of fighting for independence with lawsuits and guns, the Texas nationalists follow Brexit's battle plan of slowly gaining the support of the public and local politicians with messaging and by using ballot initiatives to bolster their cause. Although Texas couldn't leave America by ballot initiative alone, more on that later, the group hopes that a vote in their favor could force Washington to address the issue. The group claims to have 425,000 members, and that some politicians and officials privately support the movement. Since its founding almost 20 years ago, the Texas nationalist movement has made notable progress. In 2009, the governor of Texas teased that the state could try secede if Washington aggravated it too much. And in 2021, a senator said it could have to leave the union if things became hopeless for their Republicans. The state GOP stated in their party platform that Texas still had the right to secede if it ever wanted to, and a future ballot may feature a non-binding, hypothetical question asking GOP voters if they would support seceding from America. A survey from 2022 found that 60% of Texans supported peacefully leaving America to make their own country with other states. This is good for independent supporters, but many of these people would likely not support it if the prospect of secession ever became a real possibility, instead of an abstract thought. Even if they wouldn't, the constitutional law would get in the way. As you might have guessed, the government says states aren't legally allowed to leave the union on their own. You might be surprised to learn, though, that the Constitution itself never says this. It's 7,500 words long and doesn't mention secession once, even in the amendments passed after the Civil War, when it'd make the most sense to include it. But no, it was the Supreme Court that made secession illegal. They ruled in Texas v. White that Texas had never, in a legal sense, seceded from the Union during a war. A state can only leave America through successful revolution or if the federal government agrees to let it. Ironically, Texas was the one arguing that they had never seceded, so that they could reclaim federal bonds the Confederate government sold during the war. It figures that Texas would close the legal door on secession while trying to get some cash back. Of course, secessionists don't respect the White decision. They claim that the case was judged based on the goal of keeping Texas in the Union and not based on a fair reading of the Constitution. Secession is guaranteed, they say, under the 10th Amendment, which is basically the amendment that says the government doesn't have rights that aren't derived from the Constitution, in this case when a state can leave the Union, and that those rights belong to the states and the people. In short, a state government should only need the consent of its people to leave the Union. Still, Texiters, as we'll call them, are going to have an uphill battle in getting Congress to agree to this interpretation. And if they can't, their only other option is to get 2/3 of both chambers of Congress and 38 states to agree to let them leave. Another hard task. Texas accounts for almost 9% of America's population, 7% of its land, 8.5% of its GDP, and 40% and 25% of its oil and natural gas reserves, respectively. No politician wants to be remembered as the person who let all America lose all of that. Republicans are even more incentivized to vote against allowing Texas to leave, since it would cost them 2 reliable seats in the US Senate, a dozen representatives in Congress, and any chance of winning the White House in the future. Simply put, Washington would never be willing to let a state that's big enough to survive on its own secede. So if the congressional avenue to independence is closed to Texas, what about armed rebellion? Texas has more than 1 million registered guns, double that of the second most gun-filled state, Florida, and the Texas Military Forces has a budget of $1.85 billion. But that option's even more unlikely. America spends more money on its military than the next 10 biggest militaries combined. Another war of secession may cause a lot of damage and kill a lot of people, but Texas will lose that war any day of the week. No state, even Texas, is going to leave America unless America says it can leave. But what if they just did let them? What if America respected a secessionist Texas' wishes, or just got tired of dealing with them and voted to kick Texas out of the United States? Or what if Texas, alongside a bunch of other states, decided they wanted out of the US and teamed up to all vote to leave the US at once, effectively dissolving the US into a dozen or more nations? These two scenarios of a post-American world where the US government is gone with many smaller republics in its place, and one where the America we know mostly still exists interacts with the Republic of Texas, have very different implications for the newly seceded country's survival. And, as you'd expect, the second option would be much, much worse. In order to discourage other states from trying to leave the Union and make an example out of Texas, America would make Texas leave with horrible stipulations. The new republic would be saddled with debt to pay America for taking away its military bases, national parks, and 2.9 million acres of federal land alongside its share of the national debt, about $2.8 trillion, if defined by its share of America's GDP. The US would also try to define their relationship with Texas while it has all the power, including trying to gain cheap access to or even control over Texas's oil and natural gas supplies. Even in a post-America scenario where it's on an equal or better footing with other countries and avoids some of that debt, the new country would lose access to federal aid. Federal grants account for 1/3 of Texas's budget, including 60% of its health and human services budget, and the government helps Texas recover from natural disasters, including by giving $15 billion after Hurricane Harvey struck Southeast Texas in 2017. The federal government also pays for important social programs in Texas, like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. An independent Texas would have to decide whether it wants to increase taxes to make up for this loss, or if it should cut or end major social programs that Texans rely on. Texas would also have to worry about major businesses leaving the state. Texas currently has the most Fortune 500 companies of any state in the US, and more than 150 major companies have moved their headquarters to Texas in recent years. This is because Texas has many benefits for businesses, including a lack of personal or business income taxes, cheaper land and housing, a lower cost of living, and a developing tech industry with plenty of talent to fill those jobs. Some of these advantages may go away with independence, and it may introduce new problems being separated from the US. Most of the companies currently in Texas would probably quickly choose to move back to the US after the secession, which we sort of saw in a secession attempt across the Atlantic, when Catalonia tried leaving Spain, with over 700 companies leaving the region after their referendum. But Texas would fare better in a post-American world. Texas would be in a stronger position than almost every other new country, but these countries would try to implement new tax cuts and policies to convince these major companies to relocate to their country. Texas would be at risk of losing these businesses and even entire industries to states like California or New York. On the other hand, there are some factors going in Texas's favor. First, Texas would start off with a massive economy with a GDP of $2.35 trillion, making it the 8th largest economy in the world, and 9% of that money, $153 billion in total, comes from oil and gas. And as its own country, it would be the world's 4th and 3rd largest oil and natural gas producer respectively. This would help make an independent Texas an important player in the global energy trade, and a key supplier of America or post-American oil and natural gas. Energy is one of the reasons Texas's international trade is so strong. Texas exported $375.3 billion in 2021, more than double that of California's exports. And that number grew by 29% to $485.6 billion in 2022. But the downside of that is that importing things is quickly going to become more difficult. America currently has free trade agreements with 20 countries, including Mexico, Canada, South Korea, Oman, and most Latin American countries. Free trade agreements make it cheaper and easier to trade with other countries. All of these agreements would have to be either ditched or renegotiated by Texas. And without the collective wealth and power of the United States backing it up, Texas likely wouldn't get as good of a deal as it had before independence. Domestically though, the economy of Texas is in a good position. Someone who's unfamiliar with the Texas economy might be worried about it over-relying on oil and natural gas. These goods are often prone to cycles of high and low demand, which makes countries that depend on them like Venezuela extremely vulnerable when prices go down. This is something that Texas wouldn't need to worry about. They have a diverse economy that can survive downturns in oil and gas prices. Industries like manufacturing, real estate, and business services employ millions of people and contribute billions to the Texas economy. Of course, none of this is probably going to happen, for as strong as the Texas economy is, or as prideful and independent as its people are, most Texans don't want to leave America. Reservations about secessionists' other beliefs, most people's understanding of legal and practical likelihood of successfully leaving the Union, and the simple fact that most Texans are proud to be Americans, make it unlikely that secessionism will ever become the majority opinion in Texas. That's probably for the best too. If America's ever in a position where it's weak and divided enough to let a state leave, we'd all be in trouble. Thank you for watching.